World War II claimed 50 to 85 million lives. It reduced cities to radioactive ash. It produced a nightmare so horrific that even naming it gives us goosebumps. The Holocaust. And it wiped entire nations off the map. But here's a thought that should keep you up at night. It didn't have to happen at all. Today, we're stopping World War II before it ever starts. We're reclaiming the most catastrophic missed opportunity in human history. And the world we end up with, it's stranger, darker, and more fragmented than you could possibly imagine. First, I'll take you to a timeline where Hitler is crushed before he ever invades Poland. Let's start with the fatal mistake made on March the 7th, 1936. This may be the biggest diplomatic fumble in modern history. On March 7, 1936, Hitler sent 20,000 German troops into the Rhineland, a region in western Germany that had been a demilitarized zone since the end of World War I. This was a flagrant violation of both the Treaty of Versailles and the Locarno treaties. The entire international order meant to preserve peace in Europe was built on Germany staying out of this strip of land bordering France. The Rhineland existed for one reason: to ensure French security and prevent a future German invasion. And do you know what Hitler told his generals? If France shows up, retreat immediately. That's right, Hitler had ordered his troops to run back if there was any escalation. He knew he was gambling with a terrible hand. He was genuinely terrified that France would call his bluff because the German military at that point was not strong enough to challenge French forces. German generals were having panic attacks over the decision. In fact, German War Minister Werner von Blomberg and General Werner von Fritsch both opposed the move, arguing that the army was not yet prepared for a major conflict. They knew the German army was vastly inferior to France and that any confrontation would be catastrophic for the Nazi regime. But the British and the French were too cowardly to call out the German postcard painter. France had every legal right to kick them out, and in fact a treaty obligation under the Locarno mutual guarantee clauses to march forces into the Rhineland and expel the German troops. One French battalion showing up at the border would have been enough. One French battalion would have ended Hitler's gamble right there. A French military response would have severely damaged and humiliated the Nazi regime and likely led to its collapse. So why didn't France do it? There were several complex and interconnected reasons, but the most decisive one was politics. France was experiencing severe internal political and economic turmoil. A major financial crisis, a fragile caretaker government on the verge of elections. The Popular Front was rising, communists were gaining influence. The government was paralyzed by fear of starting another war so soon after the devastation of World War I. Both the public and the political leadership were still traumatized by the immense loss of life and destruction, and there was no appetite for a new conflict. And Britain? The British government, especially Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, along with much of the public, believed the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh on Germany. Many Britons felt Hitler was, quote, walking into his own backyard, end quote, as Lord Lothian put it. They sympathized with Germany's treaty violations. This was the moment. The failure of Britain and France to enforce the treaties marked the effective end of the peace established by Versailles and Locarno. It removed the primary check on Hitler's foreign policy ambitions. No military action by these two powers meant losing the last clear opportunity to stop Hitler before the start of World War II. But in our timeline, things go differently. After the Saarland referendum in 1935, Britain wakes up. Perhaps anti-Nazi politicians who fled to the Saarland before its absorption into Germany are captured. Perhaps prominent intellectuals and social democrats are rounded up in a purge. Maybe there is a Night of the Long Knives-style massacre. Political opponents are executed in the streets, and the news spreads rapidly across Europe. Suddenly, Britain sees that Hitler is willing to go to the absolute extreme to achieve his goals. Meanwhile, France devalues the franc earlier, stabilizing its economy, maintaining competitiveness, and weakening the appeal of the Popular Front. The political situation is no longer quite as dire. So when German troops march into the Rhineland in March 1936, France responds immediately. Troops mobilize and appear at the border, while Britain does its part by backing France diplomatically, making it clear to Germany that they must leave. And just as Hitler ordered, the Wehrmacht retreats. Humiliated and defeated without firing a shot, they pull back behind the Rhine, their tails between their legs. But France doesn't stop there. It investigates the true extent of Germany's secret rearmament. Through careful scrutiny, French intelligence uncovers the Luftwaffe, the expanded Wehrmacht, and the full scale of the treaty violations Hitler had been hiding. The League of Nations, now showing real backbone, imposes strict restrictions on the Spanish Civil War. Germany can no longer test its tanks and aircraft in Spain. Equipment shipments can't be hidden. The Condor Legion is severely limited. As this phase comes to an end, Germany is weaker and increasingly desperate. But Hitler moves again in 1938. Despite growing isolation, he attempts to annex Austria anyway. The Anschluss goes through, and Austria is absorbed into Germany. This time, France and Britain act decisively. They move at full speed to cripple Germany economically. A total economic embargo. Trade freezes. German goods are banned from French and British markets. British and French products are cut off from Germany. The German war economy, already running on fumes and built on continuous expansion to seize assets, begins to unravel. Industrial production slows as raw materials dry up. Unemployment rises. Food shortages emerge. The German people, who had begun to enjoy a fragile recovery driven by massive military spending, are pushed back into hardship. With all of this wearing him down, Hitler realizes he needs the Sudetenland immediately. His coffers are running dry. He needs money, resources, a win. The Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia has enormous industrial capacity. Škoda is among the best arms manufacturers in Europe. Czechoslovakia has coal mines, steel production, and chemical plants. If Hitler can seize these assets, he can keep the German war machine running and project strength to silence critics at home. Now we move to the Munich Conference in September 1938. In our history, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier folded, handing Czechoslovakia to Hitler on a silver platter. But in this timeline, Britain and France stand firm. They say no, not 1 inch of Czechoslovakia. Hitler is left with two choices: back down and admit defeat, destroying his political standing and making him appear weak to both the German military and the Nazi Party, or attack Czechoslovakia anyway and risk war with France and Britain. Hitler, being Hitler, refuses to back down. Desperate and out of options, he chooses war, dragging the entire nation into a game it cannot win. In November 1938, Germany invades Czechoslovakia. It doesn't even take weeks for France and Britain to declare war, and this conflict doesn't resemble the phony war of 1939 to 1940. France is already mobilized. French forces push into the still demilitarized Rhineland, capturing the Saarland and parts of the industrial Ruhr. With what remains of its strength, Germany throws everything into the invasion of Czechoslovakia, hoping to crush it quickly before turning west to face France. But the Czech army is strong, well-equipped, and fighting for survival. While these three sides clash head-on, Hungary waits to see who will prevail before choosing a side. Italy stays on the sidelines. Mussolini has no interest in getting involved when France is clearly prepared for war. Poland, opportunistic as ever, seizes some Czech territory just as it did historically. But it isn't enough to change the outcome. Germany is now fighting a two-front war with an army that has fuel for perhaps 3 months. The conspiracy against Hitler, the one that historically collapsed when Britain and France caved at Munich, goes forward this time. The military leadership knows the war is unwinnable. By the spring of 1939, it's over. Germany surrenders. The Nazis are removed from power. The generals, unwilling to restore either the Kaiser or the Weimar Republic, install a military junta. An emergency government takes control, and it stays in power longer than it should. The peace treaty is as harsh as the Treaty of Versailles, maybe harsher. The second time is always more bitter than the first. France, Czechoslovakia, Poland, everyone wants to make absolutely sure Germany can never rise again. The Rhineland is permanently demilitarized, creating a lasting buffer for France. To prevent Germany from ever again threatening its neighbors, the army is limited to 100,000 soldiers. Austria becomes independent and falls into Italy's sphere of influence, as Mussolini distances himself from Germany's failure. Poland, still opportunistic, annexes parts of East Prussia, specifically the Polish majority regions. Czechoslovakia receives border corrections, possibly some long-disputed territories. For the second time, Germany is forced to pay massive war reparations to Czechoslovakia. The Nazi Party is banned. Denazification begins immediately. Germany is completely broken. Democracy is restored, but under heavy Allied supervision. The Weimar Republic 2.0 now exists with foreign occupation and sharply reduced German sovereignty. As a result, many Germans see this as yet another betrayal by the West. For them, the stab-in-the-back myth has happened again. The country is humiliated, impoverished, and deeply resentful. But World War II is avoided. Millions of lives are saved. The Holocaust never happens. So you might think the world has been saved. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Not quite. Because while everyone is focused on Germany, the Soviet Union is quietly making its moves. During the German-Czech War, Stalin takes advantage of the chaos. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, previously assumed safe from German aggression. Now they become vulnerable. The Soviets are pleased because this also means Soviet occupation. It's slower and more subtle than the historical Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but the outcome is similar. We can't say exactly how fast it happens, but Bessarabia in Romania is still absorbed into the Soviet sphere. Without Poland in the equation, northern Bukovina may remain Romanian. Then comes the Winter War with Finland. This time it starts earlier, possibly under better weather conditions. The Soviets push further. It's hard to say how Finland's heroic defense unfolds once winter sets in, but the Allies, still mobilized from the German conflict, send significant aid through Sweden. In other words, the war bogs down. Eventually, a peace treaty is signed. The Soviets gain slightly more territory than they did historically, but one thing is clear. The West is willing to stop Soviet expansion when it can. You might think the Soviets would lie low after this. They don't. They've learned a lesson. Direct military conquest brings international intervention, so they change tactics. They shift to subversion, supporting communist movements, cultivating allies instead of invading them. Now this is where things get strange, really strange. By 1936, Hungary had become deeply entrenched in Germany's economy. Over half of its imports and exports flowed through Germany. Hungarian agriculture fed German cities for years. The two economies were tightly intertwined, so when Germany collapses and is hit with embargoes, Hungary's economy implodes as well. Hungary loses its primary export market. Orders for Hungarian wheat, meat and vegetables vanish. Factories that depend on German machinery and spare parts shut down. The right-wing government of Prime Minister Kalman Darani cannot manage the crisis. With no solutions on offer, unrest erupts. Protests break out in Budapest. Workers strike. Farmers march on the capital, demanding action. And the Soviet Union sees an opportunity. Stalin has been searching for ways to expand Soviet influence without direct military intervention. Hungary is the perfect target. Soviet agents infiltrate Hungarian communist groups, supplying money, weapons and training. Communist organizers mobilize angry workers and desperate farmers. presenting communism as the only force capable of saving Hungary. After months of economic collapse and political turmoil, Hungarian communists seize key government buildings in Budapest. They take control of the radio stations. They rally workers' militias in the streets. The right-wing government tries to fight back, but large parts of the army either sympathize with the revolutionaries or are too demoralized to resist. The Hungarian Soviet Republic, which collapsed in 1919, returns. Communist Hungary is reborn in the heart of Central Europe, this time backed by the Soviet Union. And its neighbors are not pleased, especially Czechoslovakia, still fully mobilized after its recent war with Germany. A communist Hungary on its southern border raises the threat of subversion spreading into Slovakia and the Czech lands. Romania is no calmer. It has just lost Bessarabia to the Soviets. Now Hungary is going communist as well. Romania feels encircled. States mobilize troops. Ultimatums are issued. Hungary is told to either dissolve the communist government or renounce all territorial claims on Slovak and Transylvanian lands. So what does Hungary do? The Soviets give a simple answer. Refuse. We've got your back. Czechoslovakia calls the bluff. In February 1940, it invades northern Hungary, framing the action as a peacekeeping operation and a preemptive move against communist aggression. The League of Nations condemns the invasion as a violation of Hungarian sovereignty. Britain and France refuse to back Czechoslovakia. They are dealing with their own economic crises and have no appetite for yet another conflict. Meanwhile, Stalin is not pleased. The Soviets threaten to intervene if Czechoslovakia does not withdraw immediately from Hungary and Slovakia. If the advance continues, the USSR warns it will be forced to act in defense of the Hungarian Revolution. But Czechoslovakia keeps pushing toward Budapest anyway. The Allies step in before the Soviets can intervene militarily. Britain and France are terrified this will spiral into a wider war. They threaten to cut off aid to Czechoslovakia unless the advance stops. They also offer to mediate negotiations between Hungary and Czechoslovakia. By mid-March 1940, a ceasefire is imposed. Czechoslovakia withdraws from Hungarian territory. Hungary promises to respect existing borders and renounce any territorial claims. Few believe it. Hungary remains communist, but it effectively becomes a North Korea in Central Europe, paranoid, isolated, surrounded by hostile neighbors who would invade again if given the chance. At home, the communist government is deeply unpopular. Many Hungarians supported the revolution out of desperation and anger over the economic collapse. But communist rule fails to deliver the prosperity it promised. Regret sets in. Another civil war between communists and nationalists becomes entirely possible. Hungary turns into a dysfunctional, failing state that no one wants to touch. Meanwhile, Yugoslavia is sliding into crisis as well. Like Hungary, it depended heavily on German trade. Germany had been its largest trading partner by far. Now that trade is gone. The economy collapses. As it does, communist movements, especially in Croatia, quietly gain ground. Josip Broz, better known as Tito, begins stirring trouble. In this timeline, he rises earlier by exploiting the economic chaos. Tito organizes workers' strikes in Croatian cities. He builds underground communist cells. He spreads propaganda blaming the Serbian monarchy for Yugoslavia's problems. Behind the scenes, the Soviet Union provides support. Stalin wants to avoid another direct confrontation with the Allies, so Moscow moves carefully. Money, weapons, advisors, Soviet aid is covert, quiet, deniable. Remember, in 1929, King Alexander I seriously considered granting Croatian independence to avoid civil war. He looked at Norway and Sweden's peaceful separation in 1905 and thought Yugoslavia might do the same. He ultimately decided against it and instead imposed a royal dictatorship to hold the country together. But King Alexander was assassinated in 1934 by a Bulgarian revolutionary with Croatian nationalist backing. Now, with Yugoslavia in economic freefall and communism spreading, Croatian separatism returns, stronger than ever. As expected, the Yugoslav experiment begins to fracture. Romania is terrified. It is surrounded by potential communist states, Hungary to the west, possibly Yugoslavia to the south. The Soviets already hold Bessarabia to the east. France is supposed to protect Romania, but France just stood by while Czechoslovakia was left to fend for itself against Hungary. Romania trusts no one. King Carol II and his government grow paranoid. Eventually, Romania may even go communist simply to survive. If Soviet dominance seems inevitable, preemptive alignment with Moscow could appear safer than invasion and occupation. Better to join willingly and preserve some autonomy, or Romania could swing hard in the opposite direction, toward an authoritarian military dictatorship. Either way, democracy in Romania is likely doomed. Either way, the Balkans become a disaster zone. By 1940, the alliance map looks insane. Europe has effectively split into hostile camps, so let's break them down. First, the democratic bloc, Britain. Still technically a superpower, though economically strained. France. Fully mobilized, deeply anxious, maintaining a large army and occupying the Rhineland. Czechoslovakia, battle-hardened, isolated, but militarily strong. Germany, occupied, resentful, and under heavy Allied supervision. Greece, aligned with Britain through long-standing ties. Portugal, officially neutral, but quietly leaning toward the democracies. Second, the Soviet bloc, the USSR, expanded cautiously, constantly testing the limits of Allied tolerance. Hungary, communist, possibly sliding into civil war, a liability the Soviets support, but only reluctantly. The Baltic states, Soviet-controlled through so-called mutual defense agreements that aren't actually mutual, and parts of Yugoslavia, where communist movements are growing stronger and may soon control entire regions. And lastly, the wildcards, countries that don't fit cleanly into either camp. Italy, attempting to rejoin the West while holding Austria as a protectorate. Poland, distrustful of everyone, nursing old grievances against the Soviets and furious over the Baltic situation. Poland gains territory from Germany, but fears being crushed between a resentful Germany and an expansionist USSR Romania, deeply paranoid. It might stay with the Allies, flip to the Soviets, or fall into fascism. No one knows. Probably not even the Romanians themselves. Yugoslavia, fragmenting, partially communist, partially nationalist, completely unstable. Europe enters a Cold War in 1940 instead of 1945. There is no World War II, but there are constant proxy conflicts, border skirmishes, ideological battles everywhere. A permanent state of low-level conflict, not total war, not peace either. And just like in our timeline, Europe's colonial empires still exist. France, Britain, Portugal, Belgium, all still holding vast colonies across Africa, French West Africa and Equatorial Africa, British East Africa, the Belgian Congo, Portuguese Angola and Mozambique, Italian Libya and Eritrea. But without World War II devastating these empires, without the United States and the Soviet Union emerging as undisputed superpowers, and without the United Nations pushing decolonization as part of a post-war consensus, the process turns far more violent. In our timeline, decolonization mostly unfolded in the 1950s and 60s. It was often bloody, as in Algeria, Kenya, or the Congo. But it was sometimes relatively peaceful, as in Ghana and much of British West Africa. In this timeline, it's far worse. The Soviets cannot directly challenge the Allies in Europe, so they export revolution. They shift their strategy towards supporting independence movements across the European empires. It's a smart move. They strike where the Allies are weakest, undermine global imperial power, and spread communism beyond Europe. Africa becomes the primary proxy battlefield. The USSR trains insurgents in Moscow and sends them back to Africa. It spreads communist propaganda through radio broadcasts and smuggled literature. Weapons are funneled to independence movements through supposedly neutral third countries. The Allies respond with brutal colonial crackdowns. Britain and France are no longer apologetic about imperialism. They double down. Every independence movement is treated as a Soviet threat. Every protest is labeled communist agitation. Every call for self-determination is dismissed as foreign interference. The violence is indescribable. In Algeria, the independence movement begins earlier and lasts longer. French colonial forces bomb villages suspected of harboring rebels. They use torture to extract information. Algerian fighters, backed by Soviet weapons and training, respond with bombings, assassinations, and ambushes. The death toll climbs into the hundreds of thousands. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising is even worse in this timeline. British colonial authorities establish detention camps to hold suspected rebels and their sympathizers. Thousands die in these camps from disease, malnutrition, and abuse. The Mau Mau, receiving Soviet aid funneled through sympathetic African states, wage a guerrilla war that drags on for years. In the Belgian Congo, one of the most resource-rich regions in Africa, the independence struggle turns into a multi-sided civil war. Different Congolese factions, some Soviet-backed, some Western-backed, others are genuinely independent, all fighting for control. Belgium sends troops to protect its economic interests, particularly the mining companies extracting copper, diamonds, and uranium. The violence is apocalyptic. Entire villages are massacred, atrocities are committed by all sides. Decolonization still happens, but it is decades slower and infinitely bloodier. Every historical independence struggle is amplified by Cold War proxy warfare. The death toll avoided by preventing World War II? It doesn't disappear. It's simply transferred to Africa and Asia. And speaking of Asia, Japan is still invading China. That hasn't changed. Japan's war in China, which began in 1937 after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, continues in this timeline. Japanese forces capture Beijing, Shanghai, and Nanjing. They commit atrocities, including the rape of Nanjing. But without Germany dominating Europe's attention, and without the fall of France opening the door to French Indochina, Japan cannot expand into Southeast Asia without provoking massive international backlash. If Japan tries to expand south to seize rubber plantations in Malaya or oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, they'll be facing Britain and France, so they're stuck in China, fighting a war they can't win. China is huge. The nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek are backed by the Western Allies. The communists under Mao Zedong are backed by the Soviet Union. If Italy is still isolated from the Western Alliance, they might back Japan, creating a three-way proxy war in Asia. And by the mid-1940s, Japanese forces were losing ground. The nationalists and communists, despite hating each other, are both fighting them. Japan loses their Chinese territories bit by bit. Maybe they retreat to Korea and Manchuria, trying to hold a defensive perimeter. Or maybe they're pushed all the way back to the Japanese home islands. When Japan is defeated, the Chinese Civil War enters Phase 2. The nationalists and communists, no longer united against a common enemy, turned on each other. And it's even more destructive than historically, because foreign powers are directly involved. Now here's what we've lost by avoiding World War II. We have to acknowledge that this part is uncomfortable. No Manhattan Project, or at least severely delayed. In our timeline, the United States launched the project in 1942, driven by fear that Nazi Germany might develop nuclear weapons first. In this timeline, there's no Nazi nuclear program to race against. Maybe we get the bomb in the 1950s. Maybe the first nuclear test was Soviet instead of American. Who knows? No mass penicillin production. In our timeline, the British and American governments poured resources into penicillin production because they needed antibiotics for wounded soldiers. But the huge wartime push to manufacture antibiotics at scale doesn't happen. Medical technology advances slower. Countless people who would have been saved by antibiotics in the 1940s and 50s die from infections in this timeline. No radar revolution. Radar gets developed, but not with the urgency of wartime Britain fighting for survival. No computer revolution. Enigma, Colossus, ENIAC. All the early computers built to crack codes or calculate ballistics trajectories. They come later, if at all. No jet engine proliferation. Germany's desperate push for wonder weapons doesn't happen. Jet technology develops at a normal pace. No space race, without V2 rockets, without captured German scientists, without the Cold War competition between superpowers, the space program is delayed by decades. The technology we take for granted in the 1950s and 60s doesn't exist yet. The transistor might come later. The microchip could be pushed back to the 1970s or 80s. And the internet, think about that. In this timeline of the year 2000, people might still be using rotary phones and writing letters instead of email. Television exists, but it's primitive, black and white, limited channels, and expensive. And it's not just technology. Society changes too. Or maybe it doesn't change. And that's the problem. The Holocaust never happens. This is, no doubt, the greatest achievement of our timeline. 6 million survived. The death camps are never built. Millions of Jews remain in Europe. Jewish culture, Yiddish language, the vibrant communities of Poland and Eastern Europe. They all thrive. But here's the problem. Extreme racism and anti-Semitism aren't discredited. Without the horror of the concentration camps exposed to the world, without the Nuremberg trials, fascism and racial pseudoscience remain academically respectable. The civil rights movement is delayed. In our timeline, black soldiers coming home from World War II demanded equality. They had fought for freedom abroad and they wanted freedom at home. That doesn't happen. The GI Bill, which helped create a black middle class and fueled the civil rights movement, doesn't exist. The push for racial justice in America comes later, if at all. Women's liberation is slower. The massive entry of women into the workforce during the war, proving they could do men's jobs. That social shift doesn't happen as quickly. The feminist movements of the 1960s and 70s might not happen, or might be much weaker. Gender equality progresses more slowly. Social welfare states develop differently. The post-war consensus in Europe that led to comprehensive social programs. It's built on different foundations, maybe never as strong. We've saved millions of lives in Europe, but we've condemned millions more to slower progress, delayed liberation, and ongoing oppression. And what about America? The United States is the wild card in all of this. Without Pearl Harbor, without World War II, the United States stays isolationist. America stays out of European and Asian conflicts. FDR might lose the 1940 election to Wendell Willkie. The New Deal's economic reforms might get rolled back. America didn't become the undisputed superpower of the late 20th century. Britain remains the dominant global power, but weakened by economic struggles and colonial conflicts. With no World War II, the UN was never created. Or maybe something similar was formed in the 1940s around European Cold War tensions, but it's a different organization with different members, different priorities. The world in this timeline is multipolar. It is fragmented, competitive, and prone to regional conflicts that could go nuclear once the atomic age arrives. The truth is, avoiding World War II doesn't create a peaceful world. It creates a different kind of hell. The 50 to 85 million death toll from World War II doesn't disappear. it just gets redistributed. The Chinese Civil War is more brutal. African decolonization is bloodier. The European Cold War turns hot multiple times. Maybe Yugoslavia became a killing field in the 1940s instead of the 1990s. And hanging over everything, the eventual development of nuclear weapons in a world that hasn't learned the lessons of total war. A world where major powers haven't seen the absolute devastation of nuclear weapons. Countries might be more willing to use them. The first nuclear exchange might not be over Berlin or Korea. It might be over the Balkans, or Africa, or China. So did we save the world by preventing World War II? Yes and no. We saved Western Europe from devastation. We prevented the Holocaust. We kept millions of people from dying in the 1940s. But we created a world that's more unstable, more fragmented, and potentially more dangerous in the long run. Remove World War II, and you get a different kind of chaos. So let me ask you, is a world without World War II really better, or just a different kind of hell?